Have you ever wondered if you could stop a desert by planting trees? At first, it sounds almost impossible. The grand deserts of our planet are enormous. They move with the wind. They bury farmland, roads, and sometimes entire communities beneath sand and dust. Planting a few trees against something that powerful seems impossible. Yet nearly 50 years ago, China decided to try exactly that. It launched one of the largest ecological engineering projects in human history, a massive belt of forests stretching across northern China, designed to slow the expansion of the Gobi Desert. Today it's often called the Great Green Wall. Today we're going to explore what scientists are learning from China's Great Green Wall and how these forests are performing, and what this ambitious project can teach us about restoring ecosystems in a changing climate. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dr. Mack, and this is the Climate Translation. Before we can understand why China planted billions of trees, we first need to understand what it was trying to stop. When people think of deserts, they imagine places that have always been dry, the Sahara or the Mojave. And while those deserts are natural landscapes, their boundaries aren't fixed. They can expand or, in some cases, shrink. It's a process called desertification. Desertification doesn't mean that green land suddenly turns into a sea of sand overnight. Instead, it typically happens when productive land gradually loses its ability to support vegetation. Sometimes this is driven by prolonged drought or overgrazing. Sometimes it's by poor farming practices that leave the soil exposed. But increasingly, climate change adds additional stress by increasing temperatures and, in some regions, making drought more severe or more frequent. Once vegetation begins disappearing, the landscape starts changing in ways that reinforce the problem. Plants do much more than make an area green. Their roots anchor the soil, and their leaves slow the wind. They help rain soak into the ground instead of just running off. And through a process we've talked about before called evapotranspiration, they move water back into the atmosphere, helping to cool the landscape. Without roots, the soil becomes easier for the wind to pick up, and without foliage, the ground heats up quicker under the sun. Over time, the land becomes drier, less fertile, and more vulnerable to erosion. It's kind of like removing a stitch from a quilt. At first, only a few threads come loose, but once enough of those threads disappear, the fabric itself begins to fall apart. That was the challenge facing parts of northern China during the second half of the 20th century. The Gobi Desert was gradually expanding southward. Large dust storms became increasingly common, sometimes carrying enormous amounts of sand and fine sediment hundreds of miles. Cities like Beijing could experience skies filled with yellow dust, reducing visibility and affecting air quality. Farmers also watched productive land become harder to cultivate as wind erosion stripped away the valuable topsoil. So in 1978, China launched what would become one of the largest ecological restoration projects ever attempted. The official name is the 3 North Shelter Belt Program, but most people know it as the Great Green Wall. The idea was simple. If the loss of vegetation helped the desert expand, could planting vegetation slow it down? The long-term goal was ambitious. Establish enormous belts of forest and other vegetation across northern China, stretching for thousands of miles, with construction continuing well into the middle of this century. Today, billions of trees have been planted. Forest cover across parts of northern China has increased substantially, and researchers have documented reductions in dust storms and improvements in vegetation across many regions. But that success raises a new scientific question. If humans can plant forests on this scale, are we simply just planting trees? Or are we actually rebuilding a functioning ecosystem? Because as scientists are discovering, those two things aren't always the same thing. So, how do you measure the health of a forest that's spread across thousands of square miles? Even with 1.4 billion people, China can't send everyone out with a tape measure to check every tree. Instead, researchers increasingly look down from space. Modern satellites can tell us an incredible amount about Earth's surface. They can detect changes in temperature, moisture, vegetation, and even how much sunlight plants are absorbing. In a study that was released from Peking University in Shenzhen, China, researchers focused on something called the Leaf Area Index, or LAI. The idea is pretty simple. Imagine you're standing beneath a tree on a sunny afternoon. If only a few leaves are overhead, plenty of sunlight reaches the ground. But if the canopy is thick and dense, very little sunlight gets through. The Leaf Area Index is essentially a way of measuring how much leafy surface exists above a given area of ground. The higher the Leaf Area Index, the denser the canopy. And that's important because leaves are where photosynthesis happens. Photosynthesis is the process that allows plants to take in water and carbon dioxide to create sugar and then release oxygen. The more healthy leaf surface a forest has, the more carbon dioxide it can pull from the atmosphere, and the more sunlight it can convert to chemical energy. When researchers compared China's planted forests to neighboring natural ones, they expected typical results. Instead, they found that the planted forests were growing their leafy canopies at an astonishing speed. Specifically, the expansion of the leaf canopy was 66% faster than the natural forests. That wasn't just a fluke by better weather or lucky positioning. The data held up even after controlling for climate, elevation, and geography. But what's important to clarify is what this actually means. This does not mean individual trees are magically growing 66% faster, nor does it mean their trunks are 66% thicker. The study looks strictly at the forest canopy, the green overhead layers, rather than the health or the mass of the entire ecosystem. But it does raise an obvious question. What's going on here? Part of the answer comes down to age. The planted forests are relatively young. Many are only a few decades old, while nearby natural forests are often much older. If you've ever watched young children grow, you've probably seen something similar. A young child can grow several inches in a year. A 25-year-old probably is not going to. Young forests behave the same way. During their early decades, trees invest enormous amounts of energy into producing new branches and leaves. As forests mature, that growth gradually slows, not because there's any unhealthiness going on, but because they're shifting from rapid expansion to long-term stability. Researchers also think the atmosphere itself may be playing a role. Plants use carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, and today's atmosphere contains significantly more carbon dioxide than it did before the Industrial Revolution. Under the right conditions, some young forests can take advantage of that additional carbon and grow more quickly. Scientists sometimes refer to this as the carbon fertilization effect. But it isn't unlimited. Trees still need sunlight and nutrients, and perhaps most importantly, they need water. Which brings us to one big question surrounding projects like the Great Green Wall. If we're encouraging billions of young, fast-growing trees to thrive in some of the driest parts of China, where is all the water coming from? At this point, you might be wondering, if the forests are growing well, reducing dust storms, and pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, what's the downside? Well, the answer isn't that the project failed. Far from it. Instead, it's that ecologists have learned something important over the past several decades. Planting trees and building a healthy forest aren't always the same thing. When the 3 North Shelter Belt program first began, the goal was straightforward: plant enough trees to stabilize the soil and slow the advancing desert. To accomplish that on a massive scale, many areas were planted with just a handful of fast-growing species. Trees like poplar were attractive because they grow quickly, establish themselves relatively easily, and could protect soil in a fairly short amount of time. From an engineering standpoint, it made sense, but ecosystems don't always behave like engineering projects. Natural forests are remarkably diverse. Different tree species grow at different rates. Their roots reach different depths. Some tolerate drought more than others. They provide habitat for different insects, birds, fungi, and microorganisms living beneath the soil. Together, all those organisms create a system that's often more resilient than any single species could be on its own. Again, think about your financial investment portfolio. If every dollar you own is invested in a single company, you can do well, but if the company struggles, everything struggles. Diversifying your investments doesn't guarantee success, but it does make your system more resilient. And forests work the same way. A forest made up of different species is often better able to withstand drought, disease, insect outbreaks, and changing environmental conditions than one dominated by a single type of tree. Researchers also have begun noticing another challenge. Trees need water. Every leaf we talked about in the last segment is constantly moving water from the soil into the atmosphere through transpiration. It's one of the reasons that forests can help cool the landscape. But that cooling comes at a cost. In northern China, water is already a limited resource. Some fast-growing species consume large amounts of groundwater, and that raises concerns about whether certain planting strategies could place additional stress on an already dry landscape. But that doesn't mean planting trees was a mistake. It just means we need to choose what trees to plant and where to plant them, because that matters just as much as the number of trees themselves. In fact, it's probably one of the most encouraging parts of this story. The Great Green Wall looks radically different today than it did in 1978. As scientists gain a better understanding of local ecosystems, restoration teams pivoted. They swapped out uniform rows for diverse mixtures of native species and planting strategies that were tailored to the local soil and the climate conditions. In short, the project grew up, and it serves as a great reminder that science isn't just about collecting data. It's about changing your approach when the facts change. The ultimate goal was never just to create a massive tree planting headcount. It was to bring a dying landscape back to life. So when we look at the project known as China's Great Green Wall, the obvious question is, did it work? The short answer is yes, but with a major caveat. It depends on how you define success. If you measure success by a drop in wind erosion, it worked. If you measure it by fewer and weaker dust storms hitting northern China, the evidence shows meaningful progress. If success means covering degraded, drying land with new vegetation, satellite data proves the landscape is visibly greener today than it was decades ago. They're remarkable accomplishments, especially considering the vast scale of this project. But scientists rarely stop asking questions once something appears successful. Instead, they're always thinking about what comes next. Can these forests remain healthy as the climate continues to change? Will they be able to withstand future droughts? Will they continue storing carbon at the same rate as they mature? How will they affect water resources over the next 50 or 100 years? These are the questions researchers are studying today. This dynamic extends far beyond northern China. We often talk about tree planting as if the tree is just a tree and any addition is a net positive, but real ecosystems don't work that way. A forest is not just a head count of trunks, it's an intricate web of hidden relationships. Trees actively negotiate with the soil beneath them, and they rely on underground fungal networks tangled around their roots. They depend on insects to pollinate and recycle nutrients, and on birds and mammals to scatter their seeds. Every single component, from the groundwater to the rainfall to the microclimate above the canopy, constantly reacts to and shapes everything else. One of the things I've tried to emphasize throughout this podcast is that our planet isn't made up of separate systems. The atmosphere influences the oceans influence the forests influence the water cycle influences agriculture. Everything's connected. And that's one of the reasons why I find the Great Green Wall so fascinating. It reminds us we're capable of restoring damaged landscapes, but it also reminds us that nature is incredibly complex. We can plant trees. We can reduce erosion. We can help ecosystems recover. But healthy ecosystems aren't assembled like a furniture from a box. They develop through countless interactions among living things over years, decades, and sometimes centuries. That might be the ultimate takeaway from the Great Green Wall. The lesson isn't that we figured out how to outsmart nature, but that we're finally learning how to cooperate with it. That shift is the most promising part of the entire project. Every year, we gain a sharper understanding of how these living systems actually function, making us a little better at helping them heal. When we look at projects like the Great Green Wall, it's easy to get lost in numbers. Billions of trees across thousands of miles. And yes, reducing dust storms and bringing green back to the desert is an incredible feat of human will. But the real lesson is, you can't outpace natural physics. Restoration isn't as simple as planting a tree and just walking away. Healthy ecosystems take time. To me, that's one of the most helpful parts of science. We don't just collect data, we learn from it and continue to ask questions. Sometimes those lessons help us to be better stewards of the planet that we all share. I'm Dr. Mack, and this has been The Climate Translation. If you have a question about the climate you've been too afraid to ask, or if you have a differing opinion, I want to hear from you. I can use your viewpoints in future episodes. You can reach me at theclimatetranslation@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.